The morning of October 16, 2004, arrived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made promises it couldn't keep. Maple leaves scattered across Main Street like abandoned love letters, their golden edges curling in the wind that swept down from the Allegheny foothills. In the Peterson house on Elm Street, 13-year-old Danny Peterson was arguing with his mother about whether he needed a jacket for his bike ride to the comic book store. "Dad's just downtown, Mum," Danny insisted, his voice carrying that particular teenage exasperation that parents know so well. He stood in the doorway of their modest two-story home, his sandy hair still messy from sleep, wearing the same Green Lantern t-shirt he'd worn 3 days running. Sarah Peterson looked up from where she was folding laundry at the kitchen table, noting how her son seemed to grow taller every time she blinked. At 13, Danny was all elbows and knees, with his father's stubborn jaw and her own curious grey eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. "Take the jacket anyway," she said, not looking up from the pile of his father's work shirts. "Your Uncle Mike called earlier. He might stop by this afternoon." Danny's face brightened at the mention of his uncle, and Sarah felt that familiar warmth she always experienced when she saw how much her brother meant to her son. Mike had been more than an uncle to Danny. He'd been the fun adult who remembered what it was like to be young, who took Danny fishing and to baseball games, who listened to his theories about superheroes and parallel universes with genuine interest. The Peterson family had always been small but tight-knit. Sarah's husband, Tom, worked long hours at the paper mill 20 minutes outside town, leaving before dawn and returning after dinner most days. It was a hard life, but an honest one, and they'd built something solid in Millbrook, a place where neighbors still waved from their porches, and the high school football games drew half the town every Friday night. Mike, Sarah's younger brother, had never married, never left town, and had instead become the third parent Danny never knew he needed. Danny grabbed his denim jacket from the hook by the door, more to appease his mother than from any real concern about the weather. "Can I get the new X-Men comic?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Saturday comic book runs had become their tradition. Sarah would give him $5, enough for one comic and a candy bar from Mitchell's Five and Dime, and Danny would spend an hour carefully choosing which story would occupy his weekend. "Just one," Sarah said, reaching into her purse for a crumpled $5 bill, "and be back by 3. Your dad promised to fix your bike chain when he gets back from helping the Hendersons move." Danny nodded, pocketing the money with the careful reverence of someone who understood its value. The Peterson family wasn't poor, exactly, but money was always measured, always considered. $5 for a comic book was a small luxury that felt enormous. The screen door slammed behind Danny as he headed toward the garage, where his red mountain bike waited. Sarah watched through the kitchen window as he wheeled it down the driveway, noting how he paused to wave at Mrs. Chen across the street before disappearing around the corner toward downtown. It was such an ordinary moment. A boy, a bike, a Saturday morning full of possibilities. She had no way of knowing it would be the last time she'd see her son's face. If stories like this move you, you might want to subscribe. We explore the mysteries that hide in plain sight, the moments that change everything. Downtown Millbrook consisted of 4 blocks of brick buildings that had stood since the 1920s, their facades weathered but dignified. Mitchell's Five and Dime occupied the corner of Main and Oak, its windows crowded with Halloween decorations and back-to-school supplies. The comic book rack stood near the front register, a spinning wire display that held the week's new releases, alongside dog-eared copies of classics that had been there for months. Danny parked his bike against the lamppost outside, not bothering to lock it. This was Millbrook, after all, where the most serious crime in recent memory had been teenagers toilet papering the mayor's house the previous Halloween. Inside, the store smelled like penny candy and floor wax. a combination that always made Danny think of Saturday mornings and infinite possibilities. He spent 20 minutes deliberating between the new X-Men issue and a Batman comic he'd missed the month before, finally settling on X-Men because Wolverine was on the cover, and Wolverine was currently his favorite character. At the register, Mrs. Mitchell, a woman in her 70s who had run the store since Danny was in kindergarten, smiled at his choice. "Good picking," she said, sliding the comic into a brown paper bag. "That Wolverine's a tough one." Danny nodded seriously, as if this observation required careful consideration, and counted out his $5 in singles and quarters. Mrs. Mitchell watched him with the fond attention she gave to all the children who frequented her store, noting his careful way of handling money and his unfailing politeness. "See you next Saturday, Danny," she called as he headed for the door. It was what she always said, a ritual as dependable as sunrise. Danny raised his hand in a wave, the paper bag tucked carefully under his arm, and stepped back into the October afternoon. That was the last confirmed sighting of Danny Peterson. Mrs. Mitchell would tell police later that he'd seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little excited about something, but nothing that had struck her as unusual. The security camera outside the bank across the street captured a blurry image of a boy on a red bike turning left on Oak Street at 1:47 p.m., but the image was too distant and too grainy to definitively confirm it was Danny. At 3 o'clock, Sarah Peterson stood at her kitchen window, watching for the familiar sight of her son pedaling up Elm Street. At 3:15, she stepped onto the front porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. At 3:30, she called Mike, asking if Danny had stopped by his house on the way home. By 4 o'clock, she was in her car, driving the 6-block route between their house and the comic book store, looking for any sign of a red mountain bike or a boy in a Green Lantern t-shirt. The bike was found 3 hours later by a group of teenagers exploring the old railroad bridge on the outskirts of town. It lay in the tall grass beside the abandoned tracks, the front wheel bent at an odd angle, Danny's new comic book scattered nearby, its pages fluttering in the wind like wounded birds. There was no sign of Danny himself, no indication of what had happened or where he might have gone. The search began that evening and continued for 3 weeks. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined local police and state investigators, combing through the dense woods that surrounded Millbrook, checking abandoned buildings, searching the creek that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. They found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not a single clue that might explain how a 13-year-old boy could simply vanish on a Saturday afternoon in a town where everyone knew everyone. Sarah Peterson aged 10 years in those 3 weeks. She slept in Danny's room, surrounded by his comic books and model airplanes, waiting for the phone to ring with news that never came. Tom took leave from the mill and spent his days driving country roads, stopping at farmhouses and gas stations, showing Danny's school picture to anyone who would look. Mike organized search parties and distributed flyers, his face growing more haggard with each passing day. The investigation eventually went cold, as such things do. Theories circulated: stranger abduction, accidental death, runaway, but nothing could be proved. The damaged bicycle suggested an accident, but the absence of Danny's body left too many questions unanswered. Had he been hurt and wandered away in confusion? Had someone taken him after the accident? Had he somehow survived and chosen not to come home? As autumn faded into winter, the searches became less frequent, the questions more whispered. The Peterson family settled into a new kind of existence, one measured not in days or weeks, but in the space where Danny should have been. His place at the dinner table remained set for months, his room unchanged, his absence a presence that filled every corner of their lives. The last entry in the official case file was dated December 3, 2004. Danny Peterson, age 13, remained missing. The case would be reviewed periodically, but with no new evidence, no witnesses, and no leads, there was little more the authorities could do. In small towns, mysteries like this become part of the landscape. Stories told and retold until they become legend. Cautionary tales that parents whisper to keep their own children close. But time, as it always does, moved forward, carrying the Peterson family and the town of Millbrook into an uncertain future, where Danny's absence became a fact of life, as unchangeable as the weather, as permanent as the seasons that continued to cycle through the years he would never see. By 2010, 6 years after Danny Peterson vanished, the search posters had long since been taken down from telephone poles and store windows. The yellow ribbons that had adorned mailboxes throughout Millbrook had faded and torn, eventually removed by homeowners who couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The town had learned to carry the weight of an unsolved mystery, the way communities do when tragedy becomes part of their shared history. Sarah Peterson had returned to work at the county library, finding solace in the quiet routine of cataloging books and helping patrons find answers to questions that actually had solutions. She moved through her days with a kind of careful efficiency, as if too much stillness might allow the grief to overwhelm her completely. Her hair had gone prematurely grey, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, but she maintained the gentle demeanor that had always defined her. Tom had aged differently, the loss carving deeper grooves into his face and bending his shoulders under an invisible weight. He'd returned to the paper mill, but worked fewer hours, unable to concentrate the way he once had. Co-workers learned not to mention the boy who had disappeared, recognizing the way Tom's jaw would tighten and his hands would clench whenever Danny's name came up in conversation. The marriage had endured, but it was different now, held together by shared sorrow rather than shared joy. Mike Peterson had perhaps changed the most. Once outgoing and quick to laugh, he'd become quieter, more introspective. He still lived in his small house on Maple Street, still worked his job at the hardware store, but something fundamental had shifted in him. He'd been the one to organize the search parties, to coordinate with law enforcement, to keep hope alive long after others had begun to accept the worst. When the active search finally ended, it was as if a part of him had been buried with it. The house on Elm Street remained largely unchanged. Danny's room stayed exactly as he'd left it, his comic book collection gathering dust on handmade shelves, his model airplane suspended from the ceiling like birds frozen in flight. Sarah cleaned the room weekly, changing the sheets on a bed that was never slept in, dusting surfaces that held nothing but memories. It wasn't healthy, the grief counselor had gently suggested, but Sarah couldn't bear the thought of packing away the remnants of her son's life. Millbrook itself had moved forward with the determined resilience of small American towns. New families arrived, children grew up hearing whispered stories about the boy who disappeared, and life continued its relentless forward motion. The railroad bridge where Danny's bike was found became a place teenagers dared each other to visit after dark, though most of them didn't actually know the full story anymore. Time has a way of turning tragedy into legend, facts into folklore. The anniversary of October 16th became an annual ritual of remembrance for the Peterson family. Each year on that date, Sarah would place fresh flowers at the spot where Danny's bike had been discovered. Tom would take the day off work and spend it walking the streets of Millbrook, as if his son might suddenly appear around any corner. Mike would close the hardware store and drive out to the lake where he'd once taken Danny fishing, sitting on the shore for hours without saying a word. In 2012, 8 years after the disappearance, there was a brief flurry of renewed interest when a boy matching Danny's description was spotted in Pittsburgh. Sarah and Tom drove the 3 hours with their hearts hammering, only to discover that the boy in question was 2 years too young and bore only a superficial resemblance to their son. The disappointment was crushing, but it reminded them that they hadn't given up hope entirely, that some part of them was still waiting for Danny to come home. The town had other mysteries now, other concerns. The paper mill had laid off a third of its workforce in 2011, forcing many families to move away in search of employment. Main Street had more empty storefronts than occupied ones, and Mitchell's Five and Dime had closed in 2013 when Mrs. Mitchell passed away at age 84. The building that had housed Danny's Saturday ritual stood vacant, its windows covered with newspaper and real estate signs that never seemed to attract serious buyers. But if you knew where to look, traces of the missing boy remained. His school picture still hung in the hallway of Millbrook Elementary, part of a display honoring former students. The library had a small memorial shelf with books about missing children and family healing, though Sarah had never been able to bring herself to read any of them. The local newspaper ran a brief remembrance piece every October, keeping Danny's story alive in the community's collective memory. Social media had changed how missing persons cases were handled, and Danny's case had gained a second life online. True crime enthusiasts dissected the few known facts, proposing theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. Sarah had created a Facebook page called Bring Danny Home that accumulated hundreds of followers over the years, people who had never met her son, but felt compelled to share his story. It provided a strange kind of comfort, knowing that strangers cared enough to keep Danny's memory alive. Mike had become something of an unofficial expert on missing children cases, spending his evenings researching similar disappearances and corresponding with other families who had lost children. He attended conferences for families of missing persons, driving hundreds of miles to sit in hotel conference rooms with people who understood his particular kind of grief. It was through these connections that he learned about new investigative techniques, DNA advances, and cold case review programs. The relationship between the three surviving members of the Peterson family had evolved into something both closer and more fragile than before. They were bound together by their shared loss, but that same loss made normal conversation difficult. How do you discuss the weather when your child is missing? How do you complain about work problems when your nephew might be dead? They learned to communicate in careful code, sharing their lives around the edges of the enormous absence that defined them. Tom had developed a habit of fixing things: neighbors' leaky faucets, broken appliances, anything that could be repaired with his hands. It was as if he was trying to fix the one thing that couldn't be fixed by proxy, finding peace in problems that had solutions. Sarah threw herself into volunteer work, organizing food drives and literacy programs, channeling her maternal instincts into caring for other people's children since she couldn't care for her own. The local police detective assigned to Danny's case, Detective Ray Morrison, had retired in 2014, but he'd made a point of personally briefing his replacement about the Peterson boy. The case file had grown thin over the years, periodic reviews that turned up nothing new, occasional tips that led nowhere, bureaucratic documentation of an investigation that had essentially stalled. New Detective Lisa Park inherited not just the case, but the weight of community expectation, the understanding that some mysteries define a place as much as its geography. By 2018, 14 years had passed since Danny Peterson rode his red mountain bike away from Mitchell's Five and Dime for the last time. The anniversary still came every October, still brought flowers to the railroad bridge and sleepless nights to Elm Street, but it had settled into the rhythm of their lives like a chronic illness, painful but manageable, devastating but survivable. Sarah was 51 now, her hair completely grey, her hands showing the first signs of arthritis. Tom was 54, retirement still years away, but already planning for days when he wouldn't have work to distract him from his thoughts. Mike was 48, unmarried and likely to remain so, his life organized around the absence of the nephew who had meant everything to him. None of them could have imagined that in 4 more years, a home renovation project 3 states away would uncover a piece of evidence that would change everything they thought they knew about October 16, 2004. None of them suspected that the truth about Danny Peterson's disappearance was written in a child's handwriting, hidden in a place where it might never have been found, waiting 18 years to reveal a betrayal so profound it would shatter what remained of their fragile peace. But that discovery was still in the future, still waiting in the walls of a house they'd never heard of, in the hands of strangers who didn't know they held the key to a mystery that had haunted a small Pennsylvania town for nearly 2 decades. The summer of 2019 brought a heat wave to Pennsylvania that seemed to press down on Millbrook like a heavy blanket, making even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. Sarah Peterson stood in the produce section of Kroger, holding a single tomato and trying to remember why she'd come to the store in the first place. At 52, she'd developed this habit of losing herself in the middle of routine tasks, her mind drifting to places where a 13-year-old boy might be living his 28th year. These episodes of distraction had become more frequent as the years passed. She would find herself standing in Danny's room, holding one of his comic books without remembering when she'd picked it up. Or she'd catch herself setting 3 places at the dinner table before remembering that their family was now just 2. The grief counselor she'd seen sporadically over the years had explained that this was normal, that time didn't heal so much as it taught you to carry the wound differently. Tom had adapted by becoming aggressively practical, as if focusing on concrete tasks could somehow balance the abstract nature of their loss. He'd expanded his unofficial handyman services to include most of their neighbors, and his garage had evolved into an informal repair shop where people brought everything from broken lawnmowers to temperamental microwaves. Working with his hands gave him a sense of control in a world that had proven frighteningly chaotic. "I can fix anything except the thing that matters most," he'd said to Sarah one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. It was one of the rare moments when he spoke directly about their loss, and Sarah had reached over to take his calloused hand, understanding exactly what he meant. Mike had found his own way of coping through what he called his research, though it had grown into something that concerned both Sarah and Tom. His house had become a shrine to missing children cases from across the country. The walls of his living room were covered with maps, photographs, and timelines tracking dozens of disappearances. He could recite statistics about missing persons with the fluency of an FBI profiler, and he maintained correspondence with families dealing with similar losses. Every few months, Mike would take vacation time to travel to other states, following leads on cases that bore some resemblance to Danny's disappearance. He'd been to Ohio to investigate a boy who'd vanished from a county fair, to West Virginia to examine the site where another child had disappeared near railroad tracks, to Maryland to interview a family whose son had gone missing after a bike ride. These trips never yielded any concrete information about Danny, but they seemed to provide Mike with a sense of purpose that he'd lost 15 years earlier. The dynamic between the 3 of them had crystallized into something both supportive and suffocating. They were bound together by their shared tragedy, but that same tragedy made it difficult for any of them to move forward in meaningful ways. Sarah had turned down 2 potential suitors over the years, unable to imagine explaining Danny's absence to someone new. Tom had declined several job opportunities that would have required relocating, unwilling to leave the place where his son might one day return. Mike had never seriously dated anyone, as if allowing himself happiness would somehow dishonor his missing nephew. Their social circle had gradually contracted as well. Other families found it difficult to complain about normal parenting challenges in front of people who would give anything to have those problems. Birthday parties and graduations became painful reminders of milestones Danny would never reach. The Petersons understood this and didn't hold it against their friends, but it left them increasingly isolated in their grief. The town of Millbrook had continued to evolve around them. The old railroad bridge where Danny's bike was found had been demolished in 2017 as part of a safety initiative, though a small memorial plaque had been installed at the site. Main Street had seen a modest revival thanks to a young couple who'd opened a craft brewery in one of the empty storefronts, drawing visitors from nearby towns who had no knowledge of the Peterson family's tragedy. New families had moved into the neighborhood over the years, children who played in the same yards where Danny had once ridden his bike. Sarah found herself watching these children with a mixture of joy and pain, noting how they grew and changed in the way Danny never would. She'd become known as the quiet woman who always had homemade cookies ready for any child who knocked on her door, though she could never quite explain why their visits meant so much to her. The annual October 16th ritual had evolved into something more community-oriented. What had started as a private family observance had grown into a small memorial service at the site where the railroad bridge had stood. Local families would gather to remember not just Danny, but all the children who had gone missing over the years. It provided a sense of solidarity for the Petersons, though it also served as a yearly reminder that their nightmare was far from unique. Detective Lisa Park had proven more dedicated to Danny's case than anyone had expected. She'd requested additional training in cold case investigation and had even used her own vacation time to attend seminars on missing children cases. Every 6 months she would visit the Peterson family to update them on any new developments, though these meetings usually consisted of her explaining why various leads had proven fruitless. In early 2020, just as the world was beginning to grapple with a global pandemic, Detective Park had arranged for Danny's case to be reviewed by a specialist in long-term missing persons investigations. The specialist had spent 2 weeks examining every piece of evidence, every interview transcript, every photograph from the original investigation. His conclusion was both thorough and heartbreaking. Without new physical evidence or witness testimony, there was simply no clear direction for the investigation to pursue. The COVID-19 pandemic had affected the Peterson family in unexpected ways. The isolation that most people found difficult was something they'd already been living with for years. The enforced stillness of lockdown gave them time to process their loss in ways they'd been too busy to attempt before. Sarah began writing letters to Danny, filling notebooks with updates about their lives and observations about how the world had changed. Tom started a vegetable garden in their backyard, finding peace in the daily routine of tending growing things. Mike used the pandemic months to digitize his extensive collection of missing persons research, creating a database that he eventually shared with several law enforcement agencies. His work had gained attention from cold case investigators across the region, and he'd been consulted on several cases that bore similarities to Danny's disappearance. It was meaningful work, but it also served as a constant reminder of how many families were living with the same unanswered questions. As 2021 approached, 17 years had passed since Danny Peterson vanished from the streets of Millbrook. His parents were entering their middle 50s, his uncle approaching 50, all of them shaped by the absence of a boy who would have been 30 years old. They'd learned to live with uncertainty, to find meaning in a story that might never have an ending, to love someone who existed now only in memory and hope. The house on Elm Street remained largely unchanged, a museum of interrupted childhood that none of them could bear to alter. Danny's room had become a place of pilgrimage for the family, somewhere they could go to feel close to him, to remember the boy he'd been, rather than focus on the man they'd never know. The comic books had yellowed with age, the model airplanes had gathered dust, but everything remained exactly as he'd left it on the morning of October 16, 2004. None of them could have imagined that hundreds of miles away, in a house they'd never heard of, a piece of their story was waiting to be discovered. A birthday card written in a child's careful handwriting, hidden in the walls for reasons they couldn't fathom, holding secrets that would explain everything and destroy whatever piece they'd managed to find. The truth was coming, carried in the hands of strangers who had no idea they were about to solve a mystery that had defined a family, a town, and 17 years of unanswered prayers. But that revelation was still a year away, still hidden, still waiting for the right moment to emerge and change everything the Peterson family thought they knew about the last day they'd seen their son. Marcus and Jennifer Williams had never heard of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, when they bought the house at 247 Oakwood Drive in Columbus, Ohio, in March 2022. The 1960s ranch-style home had been on the market for 8 months, priced to sell due to what the realtor diplomatically called deferred maintenance. The Williams family, Marcus, Jennifer, and their twin 8-year-old daughters, saw potential where others saw problems. They were the kind of people who enjoyed renovation projects, who found satisfaction in restoring something that had been neglected back to its former glory. The house had belonged to an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who had lived there alone for the past 12 years, ever since his wife died. Frank had been in his 80s when he passed away in January, and his grown children, who lived in different states, had simply wanted to sell the property quickly and divide the proceeds. The house showed signs of this neglect: peeling wallpaper, outdated fixtures, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, but the bones of the structure were solid. Marcus worked as a software engineer for a medical device company, a job that allowed him to work remotely and provided enough flexibility to tackle major home improvement projects. Jennifer was a high school English teacher who had summers free to focus on the renovation work they'd planned. The twins, Emma and Olivia, were excited about having a house with a real backyard and bedrooms they didn't have to share. They'd moved in during spring break, camping out essentially in the living room while they planned their renovation strategy. The kitchen would need to be completely gutted and rebuilt. The bathroom required new plumbing and fixtures. The entire house needed new flooring and fresh paint. It was an ambitious project, but they had time, energy, and a modest budget saved up for exactly this kind of adventure. The work began in earnest in June, after Jennifer's school year ended. They started with the kitchen, tearing out cabinets that had probably been installed when Lyndon Johnson was president. The linoleum flooring came up in stubborn sheets, revealing hardwood underneath that would be beautiful once refinished. It was satisfying work, stripping away decades of accumulated changes to reveal the original character of the house. Marcus had watched enough home renovation shows to know that old houses often held surprises, but he wasn't prepared for what they discovered when they began removing the wall between the kitchen and dining room. The wall wasn't load-bearing, according to their contractor friend who'd consulted on the project, but it had been added sometime after the house was originally built, probably in the 1980s, based on the construction techniques. As they carefully dismantled the drywall, creating as little mess as possible, Marcus noticed something odd wedged between 2 studs about 4 feet from the floor. It looked like paper, but it was too deliberately placed to be construction debris. He called Jennifer over, and together they carefully extracted what turned out to be a small envelope, yellowed with age and slightly warped from years of being pressed between wooden beams. The envelope was addressed in a child's handwriting, the letters carefully formed in the way children write when they're trying their best. To Uncle Frank, happy birthday, love, Danny. There was no last name, No return address, just this simple message written in blue ballpoint pen. The envelope had been sealed but never opened, and Jennifer could feel that there was a card inside. "Should we open it?" Jennifer asked, turning the envelope over in her hands. It felt wrong somehow, like reading someone else's mail, but the envelope had been hidden in their wall for what appeared to be years. Marcus considered this. Frank Morrison had lived in the house alone for over a decade, and none of his children had mentioned a nephew named Danny when they were finalizing the sale. "Maybe it fell behind the wall during construction," Marcus suggested, though even as he said it, he realized that didn't make sense. The envelope had been deliberately placed, wedged carefully between the studs, in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Someone had hidden this card, though why remained a mystery. They decided to open it, carefully lifting the envelope flap that had been sealed years earlier. Inside was a homemade birthday card, the front decorated with crayon drawings of balloons and birthday cake. The artwork had the enthusiastic imperfection of a child's creation, full of bright colors and cheerful imagery. But it was the message inside that made Jennifer's breath catch in her throat. The card was written in the same careful handwriting as the envelope. "Dear Uncle Frank, thank you for helping me get away. I know I can't come back home, but I want you to know I'm okay. I turned 14 today, and I wished you could be here for my birthday. I hope you can forgive me for what I had to do. I miss Mom and Dad, but you said they wouldn't understand. Thank you for keeping me safe. Love, Danny Peterson. P.S. Please don't tell anyone you know where I am." Jennifer read the message twice, then handed the card to Marcus. They stood in their half-demolished kitchen, surrounded by the debris of their renovation project, trying to make sense of what they'd discovered. The date on the postmark was October 16, 2005, exactly 1 year after the numbers written in pencil at the top of the card. October 16, 2004, the day everything changed. "This doesn't sound like a normal birthday card," Jennifer said quietly. There was something deeply unsettling about the message, the way it referenced needing to get away and not being able to come back home. The phrase "what I had to do" was particularly troubling, suggesting some kind of crisis or conflict that had led to this separation. Marcus pulled out his smartphone and did what anyone in the digital age would do. He Googled Danny Peterson missing. The search results that appeared made both of them sit down heavily on their dust-covered living room couch. The first result was a local news story from Pennsylvania about a 13-year-old boy named Danny Peterson who had vanished in October 2004, sparking a massive search that had never been resolved. The story they read was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Danny Peterson had left his home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, on October 16, 2004, to buy a comic book at the local Five and Dime store. His damaged bicycle had been found beside an abandoned railroad bridge, but Danny himself had never been seen again. The case had remained unsolved for 18 years, leaving his family to wonder what had happened to their son and brother. But the card they'd found suggested a very different story. According to this hidden message, Danny Peterson hadn't been abducted or accidentally killed. He'd been helped to get away by someone he called Uncle Frank, and the previous owner of their house had been named Frank Morrison. The card suggested that Danny had been hidden somewhere safe, that he'd celebrated his 14th birthday in wherever Frank had taken him, and that he'd been living under some kind of protection for reasons he couldn't explain to his parents. Jennifer felt sick as the implications settled in. If this card was genuine, it meant that Frank Morrison had been involved in the disappearance of a 13-year-old boy. It meant that a family in Pennsylvania had spent 18 years wondering what had happened to their son, never knowing that he'd been taken by someone he trusted, someone he called Uncle. It meant that the massive search efforts, the years of grief and uncertainty, had all been unnecessary because Danny Peterson had been hidden away by someone who claimed to be protecting him. The phrase, "what I had to do," was particularly haunting. What could a 13-year-old boy have done that would require him to disappear from his family? What situation could have been so desperate that running away with a trusted adult seemed like the only solution? And why would Frank Morrison, who had lived alone in this house for years, never reveal the truth about Danny's whereabouts? Marcus found himself thinking about Frank Morrison, the elderly man they'd never met, but whose house they now owned. The realtor had described him as a quiet widower who kept to himself, who had few visitors and fewer friends. His children had seemed eager to sell the house and settle his estate quickly, without much sentimentality about the property where their father had spent his final years. Had any of them known about Danny Peterson? Had Frank taken this secret to his grave? The discovery of the card raised more questions than it answered, but one thing was clear: they had to contact the authorities. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, a family was still waiting for answers about their missing son. The card might not solve the mystery completely, but it was the first concrete evidence about Danny Peterson's disappearance that had surfaced in 18 years. Jennifer carefully photographed the card and envelope with her phone, documenting every detail before placing them in plastic bags to preserve whatever evidence they might contain. Marcus researched the contact information for the police department in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, finding that the case was now handled by Detective Lisa Park. The phone call would be difficult. How do you explain to someone that you've found evidence about their cold case hidden in your kitchen wall? But first, they needed to process what they'd discovered. The renovation project suddenly seemed less important than the human story that had been hidden in their house for years. A 13-year-old boy had written this card, carefully decorating it with birthday balloons and messages of gratitude to someone who had helped him disappear. The boy would be 31 years old now, assuming he was still alive, and his parents would be in their 50s, having spent half their lives wondering what had happened to their child. The card represented hope and heartbreak in equal measure. Hope that Danny Peterson might still be alive somewhere, that the worst fears of his family might not have been realized. But heartbreak in the realization that he'd been taken from them by someone they'd trusted, someone who had convinced a child that his own family wouldn't understand whatever crisis he was facing. As evening fell over Columbus, Ohio, Marcus and Jennifer Williams sat in their partially renovated house, holding a piece of evidence that would change everything for a family they'd never met. The birthday card that had been hidden in their wall for 17 years was about to resurrect a cold case, challenge everything the Peterson family believed about their loss, and reveal a betrayal so profound that it would shatter the fragile peace they'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to build. Detective Lisa Park was finishing her second cup of coffee and reviewing case files when her phone rang at 8:47 a.m. on July 12, 2022. She'd been with the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years, and in that time, she'd fielded dozens of calls about Danny Peterson, alleged sightings, conspiracy theories, well-meaning tips that led nowhere. She'd learned to manage her expectations, to listen carefully while maintaining professional skepticism about each new lead. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who introduced himself as Marcus Williams, calling from Columbus, Ohio. He spoke carefully, as if he'd rehearsed what he was going to say, explaining that he and his wife had discovered something during a home renovation that might be related to the Danny Peterson case. Detective Park had heard similar claims before. People found old photographs, remembered conversations, discovered items that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Most of these calls resulted in dead ends, but her training demanded that she treat each one seriously. "We found a birthday card," Marcus explained, his voice carrying a tension that immediately caught Detective Park's attention. It was hidden in our kitchen wall between the studs. It's addressed from Danny Peterson to someone called Uncle Frank, and it's dated October 16th, 2005. The message: Detective Park, I think you need to see this card. Detective Park sat up straighter in her chair. October 16th was the anniversary of Danny's disappearance, a date that had been seared into the memory of everyone connected to the case. A birthday card dated exactly 1 year after the disappearance, hidden in a wall written by someone claiming to be Danny Peterson. This was unlike any tip she'd received before. "Can you read me the message?" she asked, already reaching for a pen and notepad. As Marcus Williams read the contents of the card, Detective Park felt the familiar mixture of hope and caution that accompanied every potential breakthrough in a cold case. The message was detailed, specific, and deeply troubling. It suggested not just that Danny Peterson was alive a year after his disappearance, but that his vanishing had been orchestrated by someone he trusted. "The previous owner of our house was named Frank Morrison," Marcus continued. "He died in January, and we bought the house from his estate. We had no idea about any of this until we found the card today." Detective Park wrote down Frank Morrison's name, already planning the research she would need to do to establish any connection between this man and the Peterson family. The phone call lasted 37 minutes. Detective Park asked detailed questions about the discovery, the condition of the card, and the circumstances of Frank Morrison's life and death. She requested that the Williams family photograph the card and envelope from multiple angles and email the images to her immediately. She also asked them to preserve the physical evidence exactly as they'd found it, explaining that it might need to be analyzed for fingerprints, DNA, or other forensic evidence. After ending the call, Detective Park sat in her office staring at her computer screen, processing what she'd just heard. If the card was genuine, it represented the first concrete evidence about Danny Peterson's whereabouts that had emerged in 18 years. But it also suggested a scenario that was almost too painful to contemplate, that the missing boy had been taken by someone his family trusted, someone who had convinced him that disappearing was necessary. The emails from Columbus arrived 43 minutes later. Detective Park opened the attached photographs with hands that trembled slightly, a reaction that surprised her. She'd been investigating crimes for over a decade, but something about this case had always affected her more deeply than others. Perhaps it was the way the Peterson family had maintained their dignity through years of uncertainty, or the fact that Danny had been only 13 when he vanished, the same age as her own nephew. The images on her screen showed exactly what Marcus Williams had described: a child's birthday card, decorated with crayon drawings of balloons and cake, containing a message that challenged everything anyone had believed about Danny Peterson's disappearance. The handwriting looked authentic to her untrained eye, matching the careful lettering of a young teenager trying to communicate something important. Detective Park's first call was to the FBI field office in Pittsburgh. Missing children cases often involved federal jurisdiction, and the discovery of evidence in Ohio related to a Pennsylvania disappearance would require coordination between multiple agencies. Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in cold cases involving minors, agreed to drive to Millbrook that afternoon to review the evidence and discuss next steps. The second call was the one Detective Park had been dreading. She needed to contact the Peterson family. Sarah, Tom, and Mike Peterson had endured 18 years of false hopes and disappointing leads. Detective Park had personally delivered bad news to them on multiple occasions, watching their faces as another potential breakthrough dissolved into nothing. This time felt different, but she'd learned to be cautious about raising expectations too quickly. She decided to call Sarah Peterson at the library where she worked, figuring that a controlled environment might be better than catching her at home, where she might be alone with whatever emotions this news might trigger. Sarah answered the phone in her professional librarian voice, but Detective Park could hear the immediate change in her tone when she identified herself. "Mrs. Peterson, I need you to sit down," Detective Park began. "We've received some information about Danny's case that I need to discuss with you. It's significant, but I want you to understand that we're still in the very early stages of investigating what it might mean." She explained about the phone call from Columbus, the discovery of the card and the message it contained, speaking slowly and clearly while Sarah Peterson absorbed each detail. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He was alive," she said, and Detective Park could hear tears in those 3 words. A year later, he was alive, and someone was hiding him. Then, after another pause, "Who is Frank Morrison? I've never heard that name before." Detective Park explained what little she knew about Frank Morrison, that he'd been the previous owner of the house where the card was found, that he'd died in January, that there was no obvious connection to the Peterson family. But she promised to investigate every aspect of Morrison's life, to determine how he might have known Danny and why he might have been involved in the boy's disappearance. "I need to tell Tom and Mike," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as the initial shock wore off. "They need to know about this. When can we see the card?" Detective Park explained that the physical evidence would need to be processed by forensic specialists, but that she could share the photographs with the family once the FBI agent arrived and they'd established proper chain of custody procedures. The call ended with Detective Park promising to update the family as soon as she had more information. She hung up the phone and immediately began researching Frank Morrison, searching through databases and public records to build a profile of the man who might hold the key to solving Danny Peterson's disappearance. Frank Morrison had been 74 years old when he died of heart failure at Columbus General Hospital. He'd lived at 247 Oakwood Drive for 12 years, ever since his wife Helen died in 2010. Before that, they'd lived in various locations around Ohio, Cleveland, Akron, Dayton, with Frank working as a mechanic and later as a maintenance supervisor for a series of manufacturing companies. He had 3 adult children, all of whom lived out of state, and according to his obituary, he'd been described as a quiet man who enjoyed fishing and working in his garden. The initial research revealed nothing that connected Frank Morrison to Millbrook, Pennsylvania, or to the Peterson family. Detective Park expanded her search, looking for any evidence that Morrison had traveled to Pennsylvania, had relatives there, or had any other connection to the area where Danny Peterson had lived. She found nothing obvious, but she'd learned that the most significant clues in cold cases were often the ones that weren't immediately apparent. Special Agent Santos arrived at 3:30 p.m., bringing with her a forensic specialist who could properly examine and document the birthday card. They established video conference calls with Marcus and Jennifer Williams in Columbus, walking them through the proper procedures for packaging and shipping the evidence to the FBI laboratory in Quantico. The card would be analyzed for fingerprints, DNA, paper composition, ink analysis, and handwriting comparison with known samples of Danny Peterson's writing. The investigation that had been dormant for years suddenly became active again. Detective Park found herself working 12-hour days, following leads that spiraled in multiple directions. She contacted Danny's former teachers to obtain samples of his handwriting from school assignments. She interviewed neighbors and family friends to determine if anyone had ever heard of Frank Morrison. She reached out to law enforcement agencies in Ohio to learn more about Morrison's background and activities. The media attention began almost immediately. Someone, Detective Park never determined who, leaked news of the discovery to a true crime blogger who had been following Danny Peterson's case for years. By the end of the week, Reporters from 3 states were calling the Millbrook Police Department, seeking interviews about the birthday card breakthrough in the 18-year-old missing persons case. The Peterson family handled the renewed attention with the same grace they'd shown throughout their ordeal, but Detective Park could see the strain it was causing. Sarah Peterson had aged visibly in the week since learning about the card, the hope and anxiety of a potential resolution taking a toll on her physical and emotional health. Tom had taken time off from work to help field phone calls and coordinate with investigators. Mike had become obsessed with researching Frank Morrison, spending every free moment trying to establish a connection between the dead man and his missing nephew. What would you have done if you'd found that card in your wall? Let us know in the comments below. 3 weeks after the discovery, the FBI laboratory results came back. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The sample was too limited, and too much time had passed to make a definitive determination about authorship. However, the paper and ink were consistent with materials available in 2005, and there were no indications that the card was a recent fabrication. Most significantly, a partial fingerprint found on the envelope matched prints taken from Danny Peterson's bedroom 18 years earlier. The fingerprint match changed everything. What had been an intriguing but uncertain lead became concrete evidence that Danny Peterson had handled the birthday card found in Frank Morrison's wall. The case was officially reopened, with additional resources allocated to determine what had happened to the missing boy and how Frank Morrison had been involved in his disappearance. But the fingerprint also raised new questions that were even more troubling than the original mystery. If Danny Peterson had written this card, if he'd been alive and in contact with Frank Morrison a year after his disappearance, what had happened to him in the 17 years since? Was he still alive somewhere, now a 31-year-old man who had spent half his life away from his family? Or had something happened to him after he'd written this birthday message to the man who had helped him disappear? The Peterson family faced a new kind of agony, the knowledge that their son had been alive. Years after they'd feared the worst, combined with the devastating realization that someone they'd never heard of had been responsible for taking him away. The hope that Danny might still be alive was matched by the horror of understanding that his disappearance hadn't been a random tragedy, but a deliberate act by someone he'd trusted enough to call Uncle. Detective Park knew that the discovery of the birthday card was just the beginning. Somewhere in Frank Morrison's past was the connection that had led him to Danny Peterson. Somewhere in the choices made 18 years ago was the truth about why a 13-year-old boy had felt compelled to disappear from his family. And somewhere, possibly, was Danny Peterson himself, a man who might not even know that his family had never stopped looking for him, never stopped hoping he would come home. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a maintenance log from the Millbrook Community Center that Detective Park discovered while combing through records from 2004. Frank Morrison's name appeared on a work order dated September 15, 2004, exactly 1 month before Danny Peterson disappeared. Morrison had been hired as a temporary maintenance worker to repair the center's heating system, a 3-week job that had brought him to Danny's hometown during the crucial period leading up to the boy's vanishing. Detective Park stared at the faded carbon copy of the work order, feeling the familiar rush of recognition that accompanied a significant discovery. This was the connection she'd been searching for, the thread that tied Frank Morrison to Millbrook and, by extension, to the Peterson family. But it also raised immediate questions about how a temporary maintenance worker had developed enough of a relationship with a 13-year-old boy to convince him to abandon his family. The Millbrook Community Center sat on Oak Street, just 2 blocks from Mitchell's Five and Dime, where Danny had bought his last comic book. The center hosted after-school programs, youth basketball leagues, and served as a gathering place for families throughout the small town. If Frank Morrison had worked there for 3 weeks in September 2004, he would have had ample opportunity to observe the daily routines of local children, to identify which ones might be vulnerable or isolated. Detective Park drove to Sarah Peterson's house that evening to share this discovery in person. The past month had transformed the Peterson family in ways that were both hopeful and devastating. The knowledge that Danny had been alive after his disappearance had lifted some of the crushing weight of uncertainty they'd carried for 18 years, but it had been replaced by new questions that were almost harder to bear. Sarah answered the door looking exhausted, her grey hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes rumpled from another sleepless night spent researching Frank Morrison online. Tom appeared behind her, his face drawn with the kind of fatigue that comes from emotional rather than physical exhaustion. Mike's car was already in the driveway. He'd been spending most evenings at his sister's house since the card was discovered, the three of them processing each new development together. "We found the connection," Detective Park announced without preamble. The Peterson family had been through enough false hopes and gentle letdowns over the years. They deserved direct communication about significant developments. She explained about the work order, about Morrison's presence in Millbrook during the month before Danny disappeared, about the proximity of the community center to places Danny would have frequented. "The community center," Mike said slowly, his face paling as the implications settled in. "Danny went there every Tuesday and Thursday for the after-school program. Sarah, remember? He'd walk there from school when you had to work late at the library." Sarah nodded, her hand covering her mouth as she realized that her son had likely encountered Frank Morrison multiple times during September 2004. Tom was already reaching for his jacket. "I want to see the maintenance logs. I want to know exactly when Morrison was there, what he was doing, who else might have seen him interact with Danny." Detective Park had expected this reaction. The Peterson family had learned to be actively involved in every aspect of the investigation into their son's disappearance. They'd never been content to wait passively for updates from law enforcement. The three of them drove to the community center that evening, even though it was closed. Detective Park had arranged to meet the current director, Maria Santos, who had worked there for 12 years and had access to all the facility's historical records. The building looked different in the fading daylight, smaller and more ordinary than it had seemed during Detective Park's earlier visit, but she could imagine how it would have appeared to a 13-year-old boy walking there after school. Maria Santos unlocked the building and led them to the basement where the maintenance office was located. The space was cramped and poorly lit, filled with boxes of old records and spare parts for various building systems, but it was also isolated, a place where a maintenance worker could interact with children away from the supervision of other adults. "We had problems with the heating system that whole month," Maria explained, pulling out a thick folder of work orders and invoices from September 2004. "It was an old boiler, constantly breaking down. We had to hire outside contractors several times that fall." She spread the documents across a folding table, and Detective Park could see Frank Morrison's name on multiple work orders, confirming that he'd been in the building regularly during the weeks before Danny's disappearance. But it was Mike Peterson who made the next crucial discovery. While examining a staff schedule from that period, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an entry dated September 28, 2004. "Tuesday afternoon youth program, volunteer assistant Mike Peterson." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Mike had volunteered at the community center during the same period when Frank Morrison was working there as a maintenance contractor. Not only had Morrison had access to Danny Peterson, but he'd also had the opportunity to observe Mike Peterson's interactions with his nephew, to understand the family dynamics, to position himself as someone the boy could trust. Sarah sank into a folding chair, the weight of this revelation almost too much to process. "You knew him," she said to Mike, her voice barely above a whisper. "You actually knew Frank Morrison?" Mike shook his head, his face ashen with confusion and growing horror. "I don't remember anyone by that name. There were several maintenance workers that month. The heating system kept breaking down, and they sent different people each time." Detective Park was already on her phone, calling Special Agent Santos to request immediate analysis of all available records from the community center during September and October 2004. They needed to determine exactly when and how Frank Morrison had encountered both Danny and Mike Peterson, and what had convinced him that helping a 13-year-old boy disappear was somehow necessary or justified. The drive back to Elm Street was conducted in tense silence, each of them processing the disturbing realization that Frank Morrison hadn't randomly selected Danny Peterson as a victim. He'd studied the family, observed their relationships, and made a calculated decision to intervene in a way that had destroyed their lives for 18 years. Over the following days, Detective Park worked with FBI analysts to reconstruct Morrison's time in Millbrook. Security footage from September 2004 had long since been recorded over, but witness interviews and document analysis began to paint a disturbing picture of a man who had deliberately insinuated himself into the Peterson family's orbit. The breakthrough came when Detective Park located Morrison's former co-worker from the heating repair company. Carl Hendricks was 67 years old, retired, and living in Akron, Ohio. He remembered Frank Morrison clearly, describing him as a quiet guy who seemed really interested in the kids at that community center. Too interested, if you ask me. According to Hendricks, Morrison had frequently found excuses to work near the areas where children gathered, had asked questions about their families and schedules, and had seemed particularly focused on one boy who came to the after-school program twice a week. Frank said the kid reminded him of his own nephew, Hendricks recalled. Said the boy seemed troubled, like he needed someone to look out for him. This revelation was devastating for the Peterson family. Morrison hadn't abducted Danny in the traditional sense. He'd groomed him, convinced him that leaving his family was necessary, positioned himself as a protector rather than a predator. The birthday card's message suddenly took on a different meaning. "Thank you for helping me get away, and you said they wouldn't understand," suggested that Morrison had manipulated Danny into believing that his family was somehow unsafe or unsupportive. But what could have made a 13-year-old boy believe that disappearing with a stranger was preferable to staying with a family who loved him? Detective Park began interviewing Danny's former classmates, teachers, and neighbors, looking for any indication of family conflict, abuse, or other circumstances that Morrison might have exploited to convince Danny that running away was necessary. The interviews revealed nothing suspicious about the Peterson family dynamics. Danny had been a well-adjusted child from a loving home, with no history of behavioral problems, academic difficulties, or conflicts with his parents. His teachers described him as quiet but engaged, a boy who got along well with his peers and seemed happy in his family situation. It was Mike Peterson himself who provided the next piece of the puzzle, though it took him days to work up the courage to share what he'd remembered. During one of their evening sessions at Sarah's house, reviewing documents and discussing theories, Mike suddenly went pale and asked to speak with Detective Park privately. They stepped onto the front porch, away from Sarah and Tom, and Mike began speaking in a voice so quiet that Detective Park had to strain to hear him. "I think I know what Morrison used to convince Danny to leave," he said. "And I think I know why the card says Danny had to forgive him for what I had to do." Mike explained that during the month Morrison was working at the community center, there had been rumors about inappropriate conduct by a volunteer coach with the youth basketball program. The allegations had never been proven, and the coach had quietly resigned before any formal investigation could take place. But the incident had created a climate of suspicion and fear among parents, with many children being warned about stranger danger and inappropriate adult behavior. Morrison must have convinced Danny that someone in his family was going to hurt him, Mike said, his voice breaking with the realization. He probably told him that running away was the only way to stay safe, that his family wouldn't believe him or protect him if he tried to report whatever Morrison claimed was happening. The manipulative genius of Morrison's approach was becoming clear. By positioning himself as a protector against an imaginary threat, he'd convinced Danny that disappearing was an act of self-preservation rather than abandonment. The boy had genuinely believed he was saving himself from danger, which explained why the birthday card expressed gratitude rather than resentment toward Morrison. But this understanding also raised the most painful question of all. If Danny Peterson had been convinced that his family couldn't protect him, if he'd spent 18 years believing that returning home would put him in danger, was it possible that he was still alive somewhere, still hiding from threats that had never actually existed? Detective Park knew they were close to solving the mystery of Danny Peterson's disappearance, but each answer only revealed new questions about what had happened to the boy after Morrison had taken him away. The birthday card from 2005 proved that Danny had been alive a year after vanishing, but 17 years had passed since then. Finding out what Morrison had done was only the beginning. Now they needed to determine where Danny Peterson was today. The answer came from an unexpected source, Frank Morrison's own medical records, which Special Agent Santos obtained through a federal warrant 3 weeks after the community center connection was established. Morrison had been treated for early-stage Alzheimer's disease beginning in 2018, and his medical files contained notes from sessions with a social worker who had been helping him organize his affairs as his condition progressed. Buried in the social worker's notes from March 2021, Detective Park found a reference that stopped her heart. Patient continues to express guilt about the boy from Pennsylvania and worries about promises he made that he can no longer keep. Recommends family counseling to address what appears to be unresolved trauma from patient's past. The social worker, Janet Marshall, was a 62-year-old woman who had specialized in elder care for over 2 decades. When Detective Park contacted her, Marshall initially cited patient confidentiality, but the federal warrant and the nature of the investigation convinced her to cooperate. What she revealed transformed the entire understanding of Frank Morrison's relationship with Danny Peterson. Frank was tormented by something he'd done years earlier, Marshall explained during a recorded interview at the FBI field office in Columbus. As his Alzheimer's progressed, he began talking about a boy he'd helped, someone he'd promised to protect but had ultimately failed. He'd become obsessed with the idea that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd destroyed a family while trying to save a child. According to Marshall's notes, Morrison had repeatedly mentioned keeping secrets in his house, documents and items that needed to be destroyed before anyone found them. He'd talked about a boy who had trusted him completely, who had believed Morrison's warnings about dangers that Morrison now realized had been exaggerated or completely fabricated. In his lucid moments, Frank understood that he'd been manipulated by his own psychological issues, Marshall continued. He'd lost his own son in a car accident in 1987, when the boy was 14. Frank never recovered from that loss, and I believe he saw Danny Peterson as a chance to save the child he couldn't save before. This revelation recontextualized everything about Morrison's actions in 2004. He hadn't been a predator in the traditional sense, but rather a deeply disturbed man whose grief had warped his judgment and led him to project his own fears onto an innocent family. Morrison had genuinely believed he was rescuing Danny Peterson, but from threats that existed primarily in his own damaged psyche. The social worker's notes also contained references to Morrison's concern about someone named David, who was living his own life now and couldn't be contacted anymore. This was the first indication that Danny Peterson might have survived beyond the 2005 birthday card, that he might have grown up under Morrison's protection and eventually established his own independent existence. Detective Park immediately began searching for any records of a young man named David who might have been connected to Frank Morrison. The search was complicated by the fact that Morrison had moved several times over the years and had apparently used cash for most transactions to avoid creating a paper trail that might lead authorities to Danny. The breakthrough came when Agent Santos located Morrison's bank records from 2005-2010, which showed regular cash withdrawals that were much larger than his normal spending patterns. The withdrawals coincided with deposits into a savings account that Morrison had opened for someone listed as David Morrison, apparently Danny Peterson living under Morrison's last name. The savings account had been closed in 2013, with the final balance transferred to an account at a different bank. Following this trail led investigators to a credit union in Cincinnati, where they discovered that David Morrison had maintained an account until 2019. The address on file was for an apartment complex in the Clifton neighborhood near the University of Cincinnati. Detective Park's hands were shaking as she dialed the phone number listed on the account. The number was no longer in service, but it provided another lead to follow. She contacted the apartment complex and learned that David Morrison had lived there for 6 years, working as a computer programmer for a local tech company and attending night classes at the university. He was a quiet tenant, the property manager recalled. Paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. He seemed sad, though, like he was carrying some kind of burden. When he moved out in 2019, he said he was relocating for work, but he didn't leave a forwarding address. The description of David Morrison that emerged from interviews with former neighbors and co-workers was heartbreaking in its implications. He'd been described as intelligent but isolated, someone who seemed to be carrying a secret that prevented him from forming close relationships. Former co-workers remembered him as competent and reliable, but noted that he never talked about his family and seemed uncomfortable when personal topics came up in conversation. David was the kind of person who ate lunch alone, recalled Susan Chen, who had worked with him at the tech company. He was friendly enough, but there was always a distance there, like he was afraid to let anyone get too close. We used to joke that he was witness protection or something, because he was so secretive about his background. The investigation revealed that David Morrison had lived an essentially normal life during his time in Cincinnati. He'd worked steady jobs, earned a degree in computer science, and had even dated occasionally, though never seriously. But he'd also lived under a false identity, using documentation that Morrison had somehow obtained for him years earlier. Most significantly, investigators discovered that David Morrison had been researching his own past in the months before he'd moved away from Cincinnati. His internet search history, obtained through a warrant, showed hundreds of queries about missing persons cases, specifically searching for information about Danny Peterson and the family he'd left behind in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. This discovery suggested that Danny Peterson had eventually learned the truth about his disappearance, that he'd come to understand the manipulation that had led him to abandon his family at age 13. The timing of his departure from Cincinnati in 2019 coincided with Frank Morrison's Alzheimer's diagnosis becoming public record, suggesting that Danny might have realized his protector was no longer capable of maintaining the lies that had defined his hidden life. Detective Park felt a mixture of hope and trepidation as she prepared to share these developments with the Peterson family. The evidence strongly suggested that Danny was alive and had been living independently for several years. But it also meant that he'd spent 15 years believing that returning to his family would put him in danger, and that he'd only recently begun to question the narrative that Morrison had constructed around his disappearance. The Peterson family received the news with the complex emotions that had characterized their entire ordeal. Sarah Peterson wept with relief at the confirmation that her son was alive, but also with grief for the years of his life that had been stolen from all of them. Tom Peterson's first reaction was anger at Frank Morrison for the deception, followed immediately by desperate hope that they might finally be able to reunite with their son. Mike Peterson's response was perhaps the most complicated. As the family member Danny had been closest to before his disappearance, Mike felt a profound sense of responsibility for what had happened. "I should have protected him," he said, though Detective Park tried to explain that Morrison's manipulation had been too sophisticated for a 13-year-old boy to recognize or resist. The challenge now was finding Danny Peterson in his current identity. He'd been careful to cover his tracks when leaving Cincinnati, and investigators suspected he might be living under yet another name. But they also knew that he'd been researching his family's current situation, which suggested he might be preparing to make contact or considering revealing his true identity. Detective Park launched a careful media campaign, working with local and national news outlets to publicize the discovery of the birthday card and the evidence that Danny Peterson was alive. The goal was to reach Danny himself, to let him know that his family was still looking for him and that the threats Morrison had warned him about had never been real. The media attention was intense but carefully managed. The Peterson family participated in interviews with reputable journalists, sharing their story while emphasizing their desire to reunite with Danny without judgment or recrimination. They spoke about their love for him, their understanding that he'd been manipulated as a child, and their desperate hope that he would feel safe enough to come home. The response was overwhelming. Tips poured in from across the country, with people reporting possible sightings and sharing information about young men who matched Danny's probable current appearance. Most of these leads proved fruitless, but they demonstrated the power of a community united in the search for answers. 3 weeks after the media campaign launched, Detective Park's phone rang with the call she'd been hoping for, but hardly dared to expect. The voice on the other end was that of a 31-year-old man who identified himself as David Morrison, calling from a payphone in Portland, Oregon. "I think," the voice said with careful pronunciation that reminded Detective Park of the way Sarah Peterson spoke, "I think you've been looking for me. My name is Danny Peterson, and I'd like to come home." The reunion was planned with the careful precision of a military operation, every detail coordinated to protect both Danny and his family from the emotional overwhelm that 18 years of separation could produce. Detective Park worked with FBI victim specialists and family counselors to design a meeting that would allow for gradual reconnection while providing professional support for the complex emotions that were certain to arise. Danny Peterson, who had been living as David Morrison for so long that hearing his birth name spoken aloud felt strange, flew from Portland to Pittsburgh on October 14, 2022, 2 days before the 18th anniversary of his disappearance. He'd requested that the initial meeting take place somewhere neutral, not in the family home where the weight of memories might prove overwhelming for everyone involved. The FBI had arranged for them to meet at a conference room in a hotel near the Pittsburgh airport, a space that felt both private and professional, removed from the media attention that had surrounded the case since the birthday card's discovery. Danny arrived an hour early, too nervous to wait in his hotel room any longer, and spent the time walking around the building's perimeter, trying to prepare himself for a conversation he'd imagined but never quite believed would happen. At 31, Danny Peterson bore a strong resemblance to his father, with the same stubborn jawline and broad shoulders, but his eyes were his mother's, the same thoughtful grey that had always seemed to take in more than they revealed. The years had treated him kindly in some ways. He was healthy and fit, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving difficult circumstances. But there was also a wariness about him, a careful way of moving through the world that spoke of someone who had learned to trust cautiously. Sarah Peterson arrived with Tom and Mike, all three of them moving with the stiff precision of people trying to control overwhelming emotions. Sarah had changed clothes 3 times that morning, unable to decide what a mother should wear to meet the son she hadn't seen since he was 13 years old. Tom carried a manila folder filled with photographs from the past 18 years, birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments they'd wanted to share with Danny but couldn't. Mike brought something simpler but perhaps more meaningful: Danny's collection of comic books, carefully preserved in protective sleeves, every issue exactly as he'd left it. The meeting began awkwardly, with handshakes and careful politeness that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. Danny sat across from his family at a conference table, Detective Park and a counselor positioned nearby, but trying to remain unobtrusive. For several minutes, no one seemed to know how to begin bridging 18 years of absence. It was Sarah who broke the silence, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You're so tall," she said, and the simple observation somehow captured everything. The years of growth she'd missed, the man her little boy had become, the fundamental change that time had wrought on all of them. Danny smiled for the first time since entering the room, and for a moment Sarah could see the 13-year-old she remembered in the curve of his mouth. "I've thought about calling you so many times," Danny said, his voice carrying traces of the Pennsylvania accent he'd never quite lost, despite years of trying to obscure his origins. "Especially after Frank died. I started researching, trying to understand what had really happened, and I realized—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed inadequate. "I realized that everything he told me about you, about why I couldn't come home, it was all lies." Tom Peterson had remained quiet through the initial exchange, but at this revelation his composure cracked. "What did he tell you?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "What did that bastard say to convince you to leave us?" The counselor gestured gently for calm, but Danny seemed to understand his father's need to know. "He said you were going to send me away," Danny explained, looking directly at Tom. "He said there had been incidents at the community center, and that you and Mom thought I was involved somehow. He convinced me that you were planning to have me arrested, that the only way to protect everyone was for me to disappear until things calmed down. The manipulation was even more sophisticated than investigators had suspected. Morrison had exploited the genuine concerns about safety at the community center to create a narrative where Danny was both victim and perpetrator, someone who needed protection but also posed a threat to his family's reputation. For a 13-year-old boy, the logic would have been impossible to question, especially coming from an adult he'd been taught to trust. "He made me believe I was protecting you," Danny continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He said that if I stayed, the police would arrest me and that would destroy Dad's reputation at work, Mom's job at the library, Uncle Mike's standing in the community. He convinced me that leaving was the most loving thing I could do for my family." Mike Peterson, who had remained silent through most of the conversation, suddenly stood up and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The realization that Morrison had used Mike's own volunteer work at the community center as part of his manipulation was almost too much to bear. Danny watched his uncle's distress with obvious pain, the same protective instinct that had made him susceptible to Morrison's lies 18 years earlier, still evident in his concern for his family's emotional well-being. "I wrote you letters," Sarah said suddenly, reaching into her purse to pull out a thick bundle of envelopes bound with a rubber band. "Every year, on your birthday, every Christmas, every time something important happened. I never sent them because I didn't know where you were, but I kept writing them anyway. I wanted you to know that we never stopped thinking about you, never stopped hoping you'd come home." Danny stared at the letters, his composed facade finally cracking completely. "I thought about you every day," he whispered. "Frank told me it would get easier, that I'd eventually stop missing home, but it never did. I used to dream about walking through the front door and finding everything exactly the same, like no time had passed at all." The counselor gently guided the conversation toward practical matters, where Danny had lived, how Morrison had cared for him, what his life had been like during the years he'd been missing. The story that emerged was complex and heartbreaking, a tale of a boy who had grown up in isolation, always aware that his existence was built on a lie, but unable to see a way back to the truth. Morrison had initially taken Danny to a cabin in rural West Virginia, a property he'd inherited from a relative and used as a retreat. For the first year, Danny had been essentially imprisoned there, with Morrison telling him that law enforcement was still searching for him and that it wasn't safe to be seen in public. The birthday card found in the wall had been written during this period, when Danny still believed Morrison was protecting him and felt grateful for the man's apparent sacrifice. "Frank was good to me in his way," Danny said, struggling to be fair to the man who had stolen his childhood, while genuinely believing he was saving it. "He made sure I continued my education, even though it was just the two of us and some correspondence courses. He taught me practical skills, tried to be a father figure, but he was also paranoid, constantly worried that someone would discover us, always moving us to new places whenever he thought we'd stayed too long in one location." As Danny had grown older and begun to question Morrison's version of events, their relationship had become more strained. Morrison had continued to insist that returning to Pennsylvania would be dangerous, but his explanations had become increasingly vague and contradictory. By the time Danny was in his early 20s, he'd begun to suspect that Morrison's mental health was deteriorating, but he'd also felt trapped by the years of false identity and illegal documentation that had defined his hidden existence. "I tried to research my family online," Danny explained, "but Frank was careful about internet access, and I was afraid that searching for information about myself might somehow alert authorities to where we were. It wasn't until after he went into the nursing home that I finally felt safe enough to learn the truth about what had happened." The truth had been devastating. Danny discovered news articles about his disappearance, learned about the extensive search efforts, saw photographs of his family aging through years of grief and uncertainty. Most painfully, he realized that the threats Morrison had warned him about had never existed, that his family had never stopped loving him or looking for him, that his disappearance had destroyed their lives in ways Morrison had never acknowledged. "I wanted to come home immediately," Danny said, looking directly at Sarah. "But I also realized that I was legally dead in some ways, that I'd been living under false documentation for years, that coming forward might create legal problems that could hurt Frank, even though he was already in late-stage Alzheimer's. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken without potentially making it worse." Tom Peterson had been listening to his son's story with growing anger, not at Danny, but at the situation that had robbed all of them of 18 years they could never recover. "None of that matters now," he said firmly. "Legal problems can be solved. What matters is that you're alive, you're here, and you want to be part of this family again." The reunion continued for nearly 4 hours, with breaks for everyone to process the emotional intensity of reconnecting after so many years of separation. They shared photographs, stories, and memories, trying to bridge the gap between the 13-year-old boy who had disappeared and the 31-year-old man who had returned. There were tears, laughter, and moments of awkward silence as they navigated the complex dynamics of rebuilding relationships that had been frozen in time. Danny learned that his room had been preserved exactly as he'd left it, that Sarah still made his favorite cookies every year on his birthday, that Mike had never married partly because he'd felt responsible for failing to protect his nephew. The family learned that Danny had become a skilled programmer, that he'd earned a college degree through online courses, that he'd tried to build a normal life despite the fundamental lie at its foundation. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation turned to the future. Danny would need to work with federal authorities to establish his legal identity and address the years he'd lived under false documentation. The family would need counseling to process the trauma of both the separation and the reunion. There would be media attention, legal complications, and the challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been interrupted at a crucial developmental stage. But there was also hope. Danny wanted to return to Millbrook, to see the places he remembered from childhood, to reconnect with the community that had never forgotten him. Sarah and Tom wanted to help him establish his legal identity and find his place in the world as the man he'd become rather than the boy they'd lost. Mike wanted to make up for the years of guidance and support he hadn't been able to provide. The day ended with Danny agreeing to return to Millbrook for a visit, not as a permanent arrangement, but as a first step toward rebuilding the connections that Morrison's manipulation had severed. Detective Park arranged for ongoing support services and legal assistance, understanding that solving the mystery of Danny's disappearance was only the beginning of the family's healing process. 3 days later, on October 17, 2022, exactly 18 years and 1 day after Danny Peterson had disappeared from the streets of Millbrook, a car pulled into the driveway of 1247 Elm Street. Sarah Peterson stood at her front door, her hands trembling as she watched her son emerge from the passenger seat and look up at the house where he'd spent the first 13 years of his life. The neighborhood was quiet, most residents respectfully staying indoors to give the family privacy, for this moment they'd waited 18 years to experience. Danny stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, taking in the familiar sights, the maple tree he'd climbed as a child, the porch where he'd sat reading comic books, the window of his bedroom where Sarah had maintained a vigil of hope for nearly 2 decades. "It looks exactly the same," he said softly, and Sarah realized that for him it was both a homecoming and a journey into the past, a collision between the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward him, not running as every instinct told her to do, but moving with the careful respect that this moment deserved. When they embraced, it was with the complex emotions of people who had loved each other across an impossible distance, who had grieved for losses that hadn't been real, who had maintained hope despite overwhelming evidence that it was futile. Danny was taller than his mother now, broader and stronger, but in her arms he felt like the child she'd never stopped missing. "Welcome home," Sarah whispered, and for the first time in 18 years, the words felt completely true. Tom and Mike joined them on the sidewalk, and the 4 of them stood together in the October afternoon, a family reunited by the accidental discovery of a birthday card hidden in a stranger's wall. There would be challenges ahead, legal complications, media attention, the difficult work of rebuilding relationships that had been interrupted by trauma. But there would also be birthdays to celebrate together, holidays to share, and the simple daily interactions that had been stolen from them by one man's damaged understanding of protection and love. The story of Danny Peterson's disappearance had finally reached its conclusion, not with the tragedy that had been feared for 18 years, but with the complex joy of a family made whole again. The boy who had vanished on a Saturday afternoon in 2004 had returned as a man who understood both the power of manipulation and the endurance of love, who had survived not just his physical absence, but the psychological burden of believing that his family was better off without him. As they walked toward the house together, Sarah Peterson realized that some stories don't end so much as they transform, evolving from tales of loss into narratives of recovery, from mysteries into testimonies about the unbreakable bonds that connect families across time and distance. The birthday card hidden in a wall had revealed not just the truth about what had happened to her son, but the deeper truth that love persists even in the face of seemingly insurmountable separation. The front door of 1247 Elm Street opened to welcome home a son who had never really been lost, only hidden, waiting for the right moment to step back into the light of a family's unwavering devotion. And in that moment, the Peterson family understood that sometimes the greatest mysteries are solved not through investigation or analysis, but through the simple act of opening a door and saying the words that matter most. Welcome home.